We have gathered together to consider individual Christhood and to study the meaning of the initiation of the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension of your soul, following in the footsteps of the great exemplar, Jesus Christ. This evening, as Jesus Christ is taken down from the cross and placed in the tomb, his soul prepares for the mission of the descent into hell, there to preach to the wayward spirits, to give them the opportunity to confess that the Son of God is Lord, which means the Son of God embodies the Word, and the Word is I am that I am. When the word Lord is used in the Old Testament, it is the four letters that stand for the name of God, the Yud-He, Vav-He. We say Lord in their place. They stand for the I am that I am. The one who is Lord, then, is the one who is the vessel for Almighty God. They said, art thou he which should come, or look we for another? They were looking for the one who would follow Moses to be the embodiment of the Word. Jesus, then, the Lord, was the one who did contain the light of the mighty I Am presence. And the Son of God is the S-U-N. The Son of God is the one who contains the white fire core of the Godhead. So the Son is the light emanation of the Almighty. Thus, it was required of these angels in hell to confess that the creation of Almighty God was Lord. And Lucifer objected and said, he is beneath us, we are above him. In desiring to be above the Son, they placed themselves above the source of the Son, who is the Father, whereupon they were cast out of heaven by Archangel Michael in the great battle of the worlds. This hour, then, that we approach, when he is placed in the tomb, is for the descent into the regions of the earth where the wayward spirits are, there where they would influence, entrap, and ensnare the children of the light. So, during the initiation of the crucifixion, if we agree to be fastened with Christ to the cross, then we also agree to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And some of these creatures are the fallen angels. And this is a mission that is given to the disciples. We understand it is given that the disciples may follow this particular initiation. The initiation, once fulfilled, leads to the inheritance collectively of the light bearers on earth, to pass through the initiation of the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension as a community or a confederacy of the 12 tribes reincarnated. This confederacy of the descent of the light of Israel and Judah was understood by our founding fathers. They founded the original colonies, the number 13, Christ and his apostles. They founded this nation to be the base of the pyramid whereby collectively the souls of light would rise together and demonstrate Christhood in the community sense, in the sense of nationhood, in the sense of the oneness of the descent of the seed of Sanat Kumara, which is referred to in the book of Revelation as the seed of the woman. The seed of the woman in the 12th chapter of the book of Revelation is the descent of the one who holds the office of the woman or the Divine Mother, and we understand that one to be the Ancient of Days, whom we call Sanat Kumara. Therefore, we must not overlook that the celebration of Easter points to our responsibility in America as a Christed nation, as Israel come again, to pass through together the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension. So immediately upon learning of the individual path, we understand that in this age, the individual path is not sufficient. And that is why the preaching of the Word is so important. That is why the Holy Spirit is given to us in this age, because the Holy Spirit leaps heart to heart across the nation. And the nation consists of the seed of the I Am race, those whose descent is from that same Lord, the I Am that I am, the same one who was incarnate in Jesus. And that race is now scattered across the face of the earth in all nations. And therefore, the seed of the I Am race is the seed in whom there burns the threefold flame and the kindling light of freedom. Those who do not have a threefold flame do not know how to be free. They will become a slave race to any totalitarian regime in any age. They comprise the anti-self or the race of the Antichrist, and they too fall into every category of race and nation. This evening, then, I would like to speak to you about the crucifixion of Christ collectively in our nation. The crucifixion of America, the spiritual America in the sense of the I Am race, its crucifixion by the passive and the active elements of Antichrist. We have reviewed last year the demonstrations of European neutralism, the forces of peace. Now we see in our own country a movement toward the nuclear freeze, the American version of pacifism. We will see how Christ can be crucified then by the passive and the aggressive elements of world forces. We cannot leave this Easter conference without the understanding that it is not sufficient to pursue a private path of Christhood. We must understand the national unity and that our America is being initiated in the 3rd century of her destiny. Whether her people understand it or not, the initiations are upon us by cosmic law and cosmic cycle. We miss these initiations, we don't understand what they are, because we do not have an identity, a national purpose, a sense of origin, a destiny, or a goal. Therefore, we are also unable to define our strategy, whether in war or in peace. And we do not understand, because the standard is not raised up, what is the standard of the individual Christ or the collective Christ consciousness of the nation. If we do not understand the standard, we do not see who is the standard bearer. And if we do not understand who is the standard bearer, we do not understand the Antichrist. And therefore we do not know who is the enemy. And if we cannot define the enemy, we cannot pursue the strategy of peace or of war. It is a serious crisis because war is springing up all around us, and the ambivalence is a problem of initiation right at the point of the line of the crucifixion, which is also the line of the mother. Those of you who have studied the cosmic clock realize that this is the 6 o'clock line. It is the turning point, and it is the place of the cross. So let us see in this segment of our communion together what is upon our nation, its consciousness, and why there is ignorance. There is a grassroots movement for a nuclear arms freeze sweeping America. This movement appears to be neither a passing fancy nor the exclusive product of the left wing. Instead, it seems to cut across all class lines. After conducting a nationwide poll, the Los Angeles Times reported on March 14, 1982, a solid majority of Americans favor an immediate freeze on the testing, production, and deployment of nuclear weapons by the United States and the Soviet Union. More than 140 congressmen have backed resolutions calling for an end to the stockpiling of nuclear weapons and reduction of warheads. About 500,000 Californians have signed petitions to put an initiative backing a nuclear arms freeze on the November ballot. Freeze proposals were adopted by 159 of Vermont's 191 towns. Similar proposals were endorsed by local or state governments in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, Oregon, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Kansas. To some degree, the call for a freeze is a reaction against President Reagan's $1.5 trillion defense spending plan and some loose talk about limited nuclear war. The arms race, it is argued, is inherently unstable and could subject the entire world to a holocaust. People are saying we have all the nuclear weapons we need. Let's just stop building, testing, and deploying them right now and sit down and talk with the Soviets. It's a very simple idea. In fact, it's too simple. It overlooks the realities of the nuclear age, and it fails to come to grips with the dynamics of either arms races or arms control, the issue that Senator Edward Kennedy, author of a resolution for the nuclear arms freeze, calls perhaps the most critical issue of our time, or of all time. But the biggest flaw in the proposals calling for an immediate nuclear freeze is that we have no way of ensuring Soviet participation in such a program. Freeze proponents argue that the Soviets realize that we all live on one planet. If they are to survive, they're going to have to do something like the freeze. Leon Wieseltier, a member of the Society of Fellows at Harvard University, recently pointed out, there is no reason to believe that the Soviets would consider such a halt. They would be putting on ice their most important industry and the thing they do best. He explains that Soviet society has been organized largely for the purpose of its military. The Russians may be prepared to prevent a nuclear holocaust, but they are surely not prepared to redo their entire social and economic structure, which is what a freeze would entail. If the Soviets are really interested in a nuclear arms freeze, they would not have offered to sell Argentina 200 pounds of potentially weapons-grade enriched uranium and a ton of heavy water just after the Falkland Island crisis began. If the Soviets did agree to a freeze, there is always the question of verification. It is not that we can't trust the Soviets. On the contrary, the record is clear. We can depend on them to cheat on the agreement. Thus, we would engage in the freeze by ourselves, since the Soviets would continue to build. This would be the modern equivalent of unilateral disarmament. The Soviets repeatedly violated the SALT I agreement, and they have broken nearly every international treaty they have ever signed. In 1955, the staff of the United States Senate Committee of the Judiciary studied the Soviets' historical record and concluded, the staff studied nearly 1,000 treaties and agreements, both bilateral and multilateral, which the Soviets have entered into not only with the United States, but with countries all over the world. The staff found that in the 38 short years since the Soviet Union came into existence, its government had broken its word to virtually every country to which it ever gave a signed promise. It signed treaties of non-aggression with neighboring states and then absorbed those states. It signed promises to refrain from revolutionary activity inside the countries with which it sought friendship, and then cynically broke those promises. It was violating the first agreement it ever signed with the United States at the very moment the Soviet envoy, Litvinov, was putting his signature to that agreement. And it is still violating the same agreement in 1955. It broke the promises it made to the Western nations during previous meetings at the summit in Tehran and Yalta. It broke Lend-Lease agreements offered to it by the United States in order to keep Stalin from surrendering to the Nazis. It violated the Charter of the United Nations. It keeps no international promises at all unless doing so is clearly advantageous to the Soviet Union. Quote, "We seriously doubt whether during the whole history of civilization any great nation has ever made as perfidious a record as this in so short a time." Anthony Sutton. As Stalin said, quote, "Words must have no relations to actions, otherwise what kind of diplomacy is it? Words are one thing, actions another. Good words are a mask for concealment of bad deeds. Sincere diplomacy is no more possible than dry water or wooden iron." End of quote from Stalin. Some freeze proponents believe that we have sophisticated technical means, our spy satellites, for example, which will allow us to verify Soviet compliance. Even if that were true, we still have to question the value of signing an agreement with someone we can trust only as far as we can spy on. But the fact of the matter is we cannot adequately verify a freeze. As George Will recently pointed out, freeze proponents cannot explain how they will provide for verification of a freeze prohibiting improved yields of warheads or improved throw weights of missiles or even new missiles. How, for example, will they verify whether new Soviet cruise missiles are nuclear armed? Verification requires on-site inspections, which the Soviets have never allowed. Yet should they allow on-site inspections, would we know if we were inspecting all of the sites? The Soviet Union is a very large place. There are other reasons why we should not engage in a nuclear freeze. At the present moment, we are far enough behind the Soviets in both nuclear and conventional arms that a freeze would virtually guarantee the Soviets a significant military advantage. It has been the threat of the United States inflicting grave damage on the Soviets that has kept them from rampant military adventurism. According to Richard R. Burt, Director of Military Affairs, Department of State, the best ways to minimize the chances of a nuclear war are through the maintenance of a balance of power and the negotiation of significant reductions. We have been able to avoid a nuclear war since the advent of the nuclear age by maintaining an equilibrium in military capabilities, and that is the policy of this administration. End of quote. Nuclear weapons can make an impact in other than the military sphere. As Midge Decter recently wrote, quote, "Nuclear weapons are, after all, not merely a measure of US-Soviet capacity for reciprocal destruction. They are also, in fact, they are predominantly an instrument of political intimidation." America's willingness in the 1970s to allow the Soviets to catch up with and then move ahead of us in nuclear development has made it possible for them to expand all over the globe. Southeast Asia, Afghanistan, Africa, the Caribbean, and to terrorize Western Europe, as we see them doing today, while we have stood by wringing our hands and issuing feeble protests. To freeze in a position of inferiority would be to abandon the whole world, including in the long run ourselves, to some form of Soviet dominion, direct or indirect. We ought to consider the fact that the word freeze itself implies extreme fear, a fear in which a catatonic state comes over the individual or the collective consciousness of the nation. It is almost like a rigor mortis to simply freeze in position, so seized with terror as to not be able to take any action against any form of enemy, whether it is a microscopic virus or an invading army or wolves barking at the back fence. Freeze in itself tells us the state of consciousness of those who have a non-alignment with personal Christhood. The mark of the Christ is the sword of the Word, the rod of power, the use of passive active forces for the maintenance of identity, the Alpha Omega light. Freeze proponents fail to recognize some important contradictions in their logic. They consider the arms race to be highly unreasonable, in fact insane. Yet they want the people who are behind the arms race to sit down and negotiate in a reasonable fashion. Freeze proponents often suggest that the Soviet leaders are even more reasonable than our own. Our leaders are provocative. The Politburo simply responds to our aggression. But even by the standards of the Freeze proponents, the Soviets must be unreasonable, for the Soviets have gone to the trouble to build an elaborate civil defense system. Freeze proponents oppose a similar civil defense program in the United States on the grounds that it is ineffective and that it will encourage rather than deter a nuclear war. Don't defend yourself. Don't provide for civil defense. It may encourage the enemy to strike. Leave yourself vulnerable, and the enemy will take pity on your helplessness. The Soviets have developed plans to evacuate their cities if a nuclear war seems likely. They are not as squeamish as many Americans are about thinking about the unthinkable. This year they will spend $2.5 billion on civil defense, while we will spend only $46.2 million. This imbalance in civil defense points to a very important defect in the logic of Freeze proponents. They assume the Soviets believe that nuclear war is unwinnable and thus unthinkable. They do not know the enemy. Because they do not know the enemy, it is logical for the Freeze proponents to believe that a freeze is a viable strategy. But the Soviets simply don't think that way. The Soviets believe that they can emerge the victors of a nuclear war. They would not spend millions and billions of dollars on civil defense if they did not think that a significant portion of their population could emerge from a nuclear war and carry on. Therefore, based on our differing approaches to nuclear war, it is also reasonable to assume that the Soviets have different goals. While we are seeking peace and the right to peacefully coexist, they are seeking peace by eliminating all possible competitive coexisters. The freeze would destabilize the US-Soviet symmetry of power in other ways. There are a variety of freeze proposals. Some, like the recent Kennedy-Hatfield proposal, would kill the B-1 bomber. But the freeze would not weaken the massive Soviet air defenses. Defenses which our aged, lumbering B-52s would have to penetrate if they were to even be considered a threat. Paradoxically, a freeze would diminish the Soviet will to negotiate an arms reduction. The Soviets, it seems, get serious about arms limitation only when American programs force them to. For example, they rejected the idea of a limitation on defense systems until the Nixon administration won congressional approval for the anti-ballistic missiles. By eliminating our ongoing programs, we would eliminate the only incentive for the Soviets to negotiate arms reduction. It seems like current US programs are among the reasons that the Soviets have put so much emphasis on a freeze. They do not want the United States to correct the nuclear imbalance in Western Europe or to redress the overall US-USSR strategic imbalance. They want to stay ahead. The Reagan administration plans to deploy 572 missiles in Europe to offset the Soviet SS-20s, but if the Russians agree to remove their nuclear missiles aimed at Western Europe, the Reagan administration has said that we will not deploy ours, the so-called Zero Plan. The Russians didn't agree to this. Instead, Leonid Brezhnev came up with his own proposal. The Soviet leadership has taken a decision to introduce unilaterally a moratorium on the deployment of medium-range nuclear armaments in the European part of the USSR. This he stated and then called upon us to follow suit. It was a Soviet proposal for a freeze in Western Europe. If we followed Brezhnev's suggestion, we would put Western Europe in jeopardy because of a preponderance of Soviet strength there. But if we do not, Brezhnev threatened, this would compel us to take retaliatory steps that would put the other side, including the United States itself, its own territory, in an analogous position. He was hinting that the Soviet Union would put nuclear weapons in Cuba, something the United States cannot live with, but which may already have occurred. The Soviets have two objectives in mind: to gain an overwhelming strategic and conventional advantage, and then overcome Western Europe and the United States without a fight. They are trying to achieve this by manipulating American and Western European public opinion, and thus pressure our governments to go along with a freeze. European neutralism, the American freeze, are the most important conditions and issues in this hour for us to give our dynamic decrees about at the St. Germain service every Saturday night. Our full attention must be directed to this issue. When you have an administration that is pursuing the only correct alternative in defense given our situation, and you have a population that will not support that administration, that goes against it, we have seen in the past, and as in the case of Vietnam, that the public opinion can defeat the president or the congressional attitude in the matter. We are dealing with mass public opinion. We're dealing with millions of Americans and millions of Europeans who have formed an opinion based on ignorance of the enemy and of themselves, and who have no idea of the strategy of war and peace. And so we have millions of people in the world today who are pursuing a path of suicide, self-suicide and the suicide of their nations, directly in line with what the international conspirators want them to do. This is the most serious and devastating development of world consciousness, and it must be checked fervently. It can be checked. We have seen the violet flame, and our dynamic decrees reverse the entire world opinion on certain considerations. But it demands attention, consistency, and constancy. Last year, there was a series of massive peace rallies in Western Europe. There is a substantial body of evidence to show the Soviets are influencing the movement, perhaps even coordinating and directing much of its activities. While analyzing the European peace movement, historian David Gress recently wrote, "It is also part of the ideology of peaceism that once the West disarms or refuses to rearm, the Soviets will follow suit. Such is the power of moral example. It is clear that a majority of the hundreds of thousands who have signed appeals and joined rallies and demonstrations against the strengthening of the theater nuclear forces in Western Europe, or against NATO and the US in general, believe that the risk of war is being increased by Western action. A majority probably also believe that any defense in a war which could go nuclear is immoral." Gress continues, "But apart from them, there are others whose commitment is not so innocent. One of them is the Danish writer Anne Herluf Pedersen, who was charged in November 1981 with having helped the Soviets spread disinformation, and in particular with having placed at Soviet expense full-page ads in Danish papers urging opposition to NATO and support for reasonable Soviet peace proposals. The ads bore no indication that they were paid for by the Russians, and they were officially sponsored by the Cooperative Committee for Peace and Security, the chief organization in the Danish peace movement. Gress says the committee is a communist front organization whose real purpose is to use the energy and enthusiasm of young Danes to discredit and undermine Danish security. According to Edward Lee, an Englishman and head of the Committee for Peace Through Security, the Soviet Union has been caught actually funding some of these European peace movements. One Soviet diplomat has been heard saying that the Soviets could have 50,000 demonstrators in the streets of Holland whenever they wanted to. In a similar vein, Lee said that the Soviets are trying to use the American Freeze movement to attain its own diplomatic and military goals. Beware when the Soviets preach or sponsor peace. As Lenin said, quote, "The existence of the Soviet Republic side by side with imperialist states for a long time is unthinkable. One or the other must triumph in the end. And before that end supervenes, a series of frightful collisions between the Soviet Republic and the bourgeois states will be inevitable." This is the report of Lenin to the Central Committee at the 8th Party Congress in 1919. It is not obvious to some people that the Soviets can pursue peace and war at the same time, or more to the point that in the hands of the Soviets, peace is a tactic for disarming a potential enemy. In a lecture at the Lenin School on Political Warfare in Moscow in 1931, Dmitry Emanuelsky stated, quote, "Today, of course, we are not strong enough to attack. To win, we shall need the element of surprise. The bourgeoisie will have to be put to sleep. So we shall begin by launching the most spectacular peace movement on record. There will be electrifying overtures and unheard of concessions. The capitalist countries, stupid and decadent, will rejoice to cooperate in their own destruction. They will jump at another chance to be friends. As soon as their guard is down, we shall smash them with our clenched fist." The United States is at a critical turning point. We have allowed the Soviets to surpass us in military strength. This is our chance to catch up. We will probably not get another. The Soviets will be tempted to use their military might to prevent us from closing the gap. They have little choice. Their economy is failing and their empire is crumbling. It is essential for them to head off a serious challenge from the West. Otherwise, their demise is imminent. The pressure of this crisis has a definite impact on American opinion, but sometimes American attitudes are contradictory. The Los Angeles Times nationwide survey reported that 57% of those who responded support the freeze, while 37% were against it. 55% of Americans said they find the subject of nuclear war so depressing they do not want to think about it. And 7 out of 10 Americans said that they feel powerless to do anything about it. Half said they consider civil defense and evacuation plans a waste of time and money, while 36% believe such efforts are a necessary precaution. The Times poll also revealed that 60% believe that if war broke out between the United States and the Soviet Union, it would become an all-out nuclear war that would mean the end of Russian and American civilization. But a 2-to-1 majority believe that the United States should get tougher with Russia, even if that means risking war. Even though they expressed willingness to get tougher with the Soviets, most Americans support cuts in the Reagan-proposed defense budget. And despite Soviet efforts to appear reasonable and to make the United States appear provocative, the Times poll showed that 85% of those polled agree that the Soviet Union is not doing all it can to keep peace in the world, while only 43% said that they believe the United States is not doing all that it can. We are in a position now where the Soviet Union is balanced at a critical point. It could crumble from within. It could go through internal dissolution and decay. It is the moment when Western nations must summon the force of the Kundalini, the force of the Mother Flame, the force of the sword Excalibur raised as the rod of the spinal altar. Western nations and leaders are without spine because they are without morality. They do not have the force of their own godhood individually, therefore they do not have the will to make right decision and right judgment. Indecision is based on the absence of the raised light of Serapis Bey. This is a moment when we must pursue a strategy, economic, military, political, and especially in the PR, the public relations of our own nation, to hold the line for the defeat of the Soviet Union from within. This war can be won by the sword of peace. But a nuclear freeze is not a sword of peace. We hold within our hands, the international bankers hold within their hands, the monopoly capitalists hold within their hands the ability to stop the Soviet Union in its tracks. We, the people of the United States of America and the light bearers throughout the world, must see to it that we unite and exercise our will to control the unabated sending of supplies, material, science, technology, money, wheat to the Soviet Union and bloc countries. This is where the war must be waged, and the people of the United States are ignorant, totally ignorant, that they have built the Soviet Empire and the Soviet military complex, and that they are paying for the Soviet adventurism in Central America and elsewhere. We have a call, a mighty call from the Lord to go forth and inform our people, to give them this enlightenment, this illumination. This very statement and paper, brief as it is, contains the nucleus of that information. It is so important that our people be stripped of that fear, which is the death culture and the death consciousness of the world Nephilim conspiracy. Our people must be stripped of fear because it is Antichrist. It is the final dregs of opposition to the Lord Jesus Christ in the final period of his 2,000-year dispensation. Fear is gripping the planetary body in every way while the Nephilim go marching on. There is no reason why a paperback book exposing the strategy of war and peace should not go forth from this office, from this organization, and from this printing press. We have the information, we have the understanding, and there is no reason why you should not shout it from the housetops. We must change world public opinion, and God is able. God is the power of the Holy Spirit to work his work through you. He needs hands and feet and hearts and voices ringing and singing, and you are capable. And many of you who are capable are not talking, are not walking with the Lord, and are not preaching the word because you have accepted a certain futility, a certain hopelessness, which is a part of this American consciousness. I feel helpless to do anything about nuclear war, and so it becomes the unthinkable, the non-subject. You do not have to wait for a book to tell your neighbor, but the book ought to be forthcoming with a proper editorial, publishing support. Most Americans do not understand the nature of war. Lanello said, "Tell them." The message he left us with, open your Climb the Highest Mountain and look at that poem. Tell them. He cried out, he pleaded with us, his disciples. Tell them. I no longer have a physical voice. You must go and tell them. I take it personally, you must take it personally. To me, he said, Elizabeth, tell them. You must pronounce your own name, and no, he said it to you. He said to you, you, tell them. We're not the first people not to understand the nature of war. In the 4th century BC, the great city of Carthage engaged Rome in a struggle for dominance. The comparison between Carthage and Rome during the Punic Wars and the rivalry between capitalism and communism is striking. Carthage dominated the sea lanes with overwhelming naval power. Rome came to realize that she must either stop short in her career of conquest or build fleets to contend with her enemy at sea. Rome, as the Soviet Union is doing today, built a great fleet and finally gained control of the sea. In the meantime, Carthage grew rich and strong and carried on trade with all of the then known world. While the Roman Senate was planning to attack Carthage, a young Carthaginian named Hannibal made a daring march across the mountains to invade Rome. Although his campaign was successful, he became one man fighting against an entire nation. Neither his countrymen nor the Carthaginian Senate would support him. The overall effect was it strengthened the anti-war party in Carthage, and negotiations were opened with Rome to sue for peace. Carthage exerted every effort to avoid renewal of war. Carthage sent ambassadors to Italy to arrange terms of peace, but they were treated with ill-disguised contempt, and the endeavor to ratify preliminary peace proposals was not successful. A Roman fleet appeared off the coast of Africa, and the Carthaginians were informed that as they had no further necessity to engage in hostilities, they were to deliver up all their arms and munitions of war. Astonishing as this demand was, the Carthaginians complied at once. When this was accomplished, the Romans discarded all pretense and made the real purpose of their expedition known. Carthage must be destroyed. When the people of Carthage heard the final demand, they realized they had been tricked. Wild with grief and anger, they turned on their leaders, who urged appeasement, and tore them limb from limb. Then they sought frantically to rebuild their own defenses, but it was too late. The city was taken, and its inhabitants put to the sword. Carthage was razed without a trace, and the soil was sown with salt. The devastation was as complete as the result would be of a modern all-out nuclear attack. They believe the lie of peace, peace, when there is no peace. If Rome had openly announced its intention to march on Carthage, it is highly unlikely that the Carthaginians would have surrendered. And history has shown it is very difficult to attack an opponent who is prepared and waiting. Sun Tzu, the famous Chinese military philosopher, pointed out that all warfare is based on deception. Even though it is easy for anyone to understand the final tactics whereby one nation defeats another, the strategy which made the tactics successful may not, indeed should not, be easy to see. Sun Tzu left a series of principles which, if applied, bring about victory. He said, "Anciently, the skillful warriors first made themselves invincible and awaited the enemy's moment of vulnerability. Invincibility depends on one's self, the enemy's vulnerability on him. It follows that those skilled in war can make themselves invincible, but cannot cause an enemy to be certainly vulnerable." End of quote. In the case of Carthage, they made themselves vulnerable. The question remains, will we do the same today? If the proponents of nuclear freeze and European disarmament have their way, we will see Carthage repeated and carnage before our eyes. The Soviets have developed a military capability which makes them fully able to destroy the United States if they desire to. And even though their doctrine calls for dominance over the West, they may not, in the final analysis, launch an all-out attack. And this would be entirely in accordance with the principles of war. Sun Tzu said, quote, "Generally in war, the best policy is to take a state intact. To ruin it is inferior to this. To capture the enemy's army is better than to destroy it. To win 100 victories in 100 battles is not the acme of skill. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill." Thus, what is of supreme importance in war is to attack the enemy's strategy. Attack the enemy's strategy. That means it's a war of the mind and a war of nerves. The war is won or lost psychologically. The Soviets are attempting to thwart our strategy of rebuilding our defenses and protecting Europe via an orchestrated peace offensive. They are doing what the Chinese conceived of centuries ago: attack plans at their inception. Attack a plan at its inception. Attack the idea of Christ at the point of its conception as it descends into your mind. The enemy works against your conceptualization of your Christhood, individually and nationally. All maneuvers of the Soviet Union today are against the inception of the idea of the identity of America. We are in the Aries cycle of the year. It is the first sign of the zodiac. It is the point where you and I declare, "I am who I am." It is the point of the inception of the idea of individuality. The attack is on the mind of Christ in you. Let that mind which was in Christ Jesus be in you. The force knows where the victory begins. Moscow is applying Sun Tzu's counsel by trying to divide the United States and our NATO nations, disrupting our alliances. Sun Tzu advised his generals to attack cities only when there is no alternative. He concluded, "Thus, those skilled in war subdue the enemy's army without battle. They capture his cities without assaulting them, and overthrow his state without protracted operations." Sun Tzu encouraged creating internal divisions and dissensions within the enemy camp, so that by the time the battle took place, if indeed one was necessary, victory was assured. That is why he counseled, "War is a matter of vital importance to the state, the province of life or death, the road to survival or ruin. It is mandatory that it be thoroughly studied." Most Americans do not understand what war is. We understand battle, but we do not understand that the Soviets are engaged in a long-term struggle against us. We need to learn the art of the indirect strategy, the art of defeating our enemies without fighting. Strategy is based on principles, not popular opinion, emotional reactions, greed, pride, or any other human condition. Strategy is based on principles of individual Christhood, not on human fear or human sympathy. Quote, "Those skilled in war cultivate the Tao and preserve the laws and are therefore able to formulate victorious policies." Sun Tzu. We have a kaleidoscopic series of challenges. El Salvador, Western Europe, the Middle East among them. Whereas we need adequate military strength, we also need the wisdom to carry out our plans. In order for any nation to be successful, it must have a goal. And in order to define the goal, we must know who we are and what we stand for. Then we will be able to correctly assess whether to build or negotiate, defend or attack. As Sun Tzu said, know the enemy and know yourself. In 100 battles, you will never be in peril. The Elohim came for the turning of worlds. This is the world consciousness that can yet be turned. It is still in the mist. It has not crystallized. Before the mist becomes the crystal, there is alternative action. There is the possibility of change without having suffered loss because of the crystallization of wrong thought. This is where we are, and this is where we have to push back, transmute, illumine, and inform. I would like you to actually consider now the possibility of the Soviet Union potentially launching a successful first strike against the United States. Many Americans believe the Soviets would never do it for fear of American reprisals. Nevertheless, if the Soviets develop what they believe to be a significant lead in nuclear forces, they might conclude that they could launch a successful first strike. And it is also possible that the United States would be unwilling or unable to respond. Such a first strike would be the crucifixion of the Son of God, the collective Son in the I Am race worldwide. The United States, its people, has never considered launching a first strike against the Soviet Union. We have always sensed that our military is for our defense against the aggressor nation, truly against a Nephilim conspiracy whose members are in our own ranks. This subject of the crucifixion of America through a first strike is the subject of a documentary, a portion of which I would like you to see at this time.
Its strategic nuclear forces to deter thermonuclear war. The strength of this deterrence was based on the calculation that we would inflict terrible destruction in retaliation for a nuclear attack. This doctrine of assured destruction is dependent on the certainty in the mind of an aggressor that we have the will and ability to retaliate. To always maintain this ability, a sufficient portion of our strategic forces must be able to survive any nuclear exchange, even a surprise first strike. Whether America's strategic forces will continue to be able to survive such a disarming, preemptive attack is today a matter of increasing uncertainty.
Oscar Control, trip 14-Oscar, on your access. Request entry, Captain Stanton, +1.
That's 10-4, you advised to the contents of your vehicle?
That's affirmative.
10-4, be advised to do that permission to enter at this time. Have team keep up the SCC door call identification, please.
10-4.
165.
I'll vouch for Lieutenant Krause.
Thank you, sir.
Security preference. Thank you. Okay, sir, flight status is normal. You have one dispatch at Oscar 11, trip 64. The ART's on normal patrol. There's no sight checks due, sir, and no problems with the personnel, no weather warnings.
Sounds good. Is Captain Stanton ready to authenticate? Delta, Echo, Foxtrot, Golf, Hotel, Victor. Yep.
What do I do?
Draw.
Yeah. There we go.
Hey, look, you guys gonna be using your truck in the next half hour or so?
I don't think so. What do you need it for?
Squadron just called me up, told me I had to get down there for a critique in about 15 minutes from now when Gunner took our truck.
Okay, we'll check with our guys. Have you seen them around at all?
You can go ahead. I only need one more car.
Put some threes down. Oh, I'll take those. Hey, how you doing, guys?
Hey, Michael.
What's happening?
Who's winning?
Charlie.
Charlie's winning? Uh-oh.
I got it eaten up this time. Look at that.
Charlie.
Hey, just want to tell you guys there's some new movies in. We got a movie sorted tonight. Yeah.
Hey, all right.
Animal House is in, and they got Up in Smoke, too, so we're going to have a double movie tonight.
Up in Smoke. Decent flick.
Save some time up for that, yeah.
You bet.
It's a trash rig hat.
Taking lines 2 and 4.
Bridge after captain, lines 2 and 4 are in.
Freeway check, pilot. Freeway check, co-pilot. Control and trim check.
Check channel 7 coming up, please.
Okay, looks okay here.
You know you got your wings and you get a missile badge.
General's aboard.
Morning, Major Reinhardt.
Morning, sir. How are you? Welcome
How
aboard.
are you? Thank you very much. Morning, everybody. Stand easy, please. How's everybody today? Good. You have the key. Thank you very much. Are you ready to give me the briefing, Major Reinhardt?
Yes, sir. The ops briefing for today's Looking Glass sortie. Higher headquarters missions being flown today. We have one flying from Hickam to Kadena, 8 F-4s, 4 KC-135s. They were executed by the SAC Underground at 04:15 this morning.
Okay.
During our airborne tour today, we'll be transmitting 3 messages. They'll be going to the 319th Bomb Wing at Grand Forks. The first one will be going approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes after airborne, following up on the second message at 2 hours and 23 minutes after airborne, and the exercise will be terminated at 2 hours and 30 minutes. The President is located in Camp David. The Commander-in-Chief of Europe is out of position until the 21st, and the Vice Sink-Sank is at Andrews for the day. He'll be back later this evening at approximately 1900 Zulu.
Okay, do we have the updated list of the NCA successors on board?
Yes, sir. We have that at the 4 status position available for your use.
Thank you.
Sir, this is the, how you doing, sir? This is the current world intelligence situation, and you might pay particular note to the nuclear submarines off the east and west coast.
Okay.
And then back here we have the situations that have changed in the last 12 hours worldwide.
Okay, I'll complete the review of those after we get airborne.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, could I have some with sugar and cream, please?
Sounds like they're ready to come in.
Okay, if you call line position, swing all over the last row.
All right. Yes, this is Oscar Swing. Thank you.
Stand clear. How's it going? Good. How's the weather topside?
Oh, just
beautiful.
fine. Excellent.
Morning. How you doing? What do you have for us today?
Everything looks to be normal.
What's the status of the equipment building?
All operational, no maintenance present or expected. LF status. All sorties are clean and green with the exception of Oscar 11. You have maintenance on site for 2 more hours.
Got all your bolts out yet, guys?
Just about. I'm on the last 3. I'll definitely in the index, though.
Okay, let me know when you get them out.
Sure.
I have it. I've got the link at 26.
We've got the link, North Station, 26 past the hour.
Thank you. General, we have the link at 26 past the hour. We're on the Lions ground entry point at this time. Thank you.
The SAC Airborne Command Post with a communications check. How do you hear me?
You're loud and clear, sir. Help me.
I have you loud and clear, too. Many thanks. Major Reinhardt, you're cleared for the PAS check.
Skybird, this is the SAC Airborne Command Post with a test of the primary alerting system. Acknowledge now. The following stations acknowledge by voice. 8th Air Force, over.
8th Air Force, 1 exception, checking.
15th Air Force, over.
15th Air Force, no exceptions.
Out. Okay, we have 1 exception. We'll have to check up on that.
Implement confidence reporting. Missile warning, this is Beale. Stand by for confidence reporting.
SSCO, no malfunction.
Missile warning, no malfunction.
Keep trying. Missile warning, this is Beale. Confidence is high. I repeat, confidence is high. Roger, we've got 32 targets in track and 10 impacting points. I want to confirm, is this an exercise? Roger, copy. This is not an exercise.
General, this is Senior Controller at the command post. We have a warning message that requires your immediate presence.
There's the command center with a warning conference, stand by. There's the command center with a warning conference, stand by. There's the command center with a warning conference, stand by. The system display for east is medium. We have predicted impacts of moderate count at this time.
Hello, SAC Warning Controller. This is the Airborne. Confirm inbound missiles on the U.S. Roger, understand. Major Reinhardt, we have 12 sea-launched ballistic missiles inbound on the U.S. now.
Yeah. You gonna go out with me tomorrow night? Oh, I thought maybe we'd check out the hacienda and have a dinner or something. Might even let you treat. You don't mind, do you? Hey, I gotta go.
Stand by to copy the message.
Stand by.
Klaxon, Klaxon, Klaxon. Message follows. Alpha 7, 8, November, Foxtrot, 1, 5, 2, 2.
That's gotta be nether right there. Yeah, we were working there.
How about the Hulk one over at the BX? It starts moaning and everything.
know EWs are slow, but come on.
Hey, you're the guy that can't run the checklist.
Getting the message yet?
Yeah, I'm listening.
All right, Coochie's waiting for us. Let's go.
Okay, man.
I got the key. Go, come on. Yeah, you got it. Okay, last man. Brakes are set, Coke. Battery's on. Interphone. It's on. 2-8, clear ground.
External power check 9. Stand by to start.
Okay, get them up.
2-8 are up. Good cuts.
Good fire. Rotation ignition.
Thruster coming.
Okay.
F-05 canceled via Alcatel flush route, Arizona P 3-2, squawk 4374.
Sir, we've just received a message from the SAC Underground Command Post putting all the SAC Force crews in their aircraft with their engines started. It appears that it's in response to the NORAD message we just received on the missile attack warning.
And our checklist calls for us to open the clacker box.
Yes, sir, we need access to the keys and the authentication documents at this time.
And do you have your key?
Yes, sir.
Roger, understand. Major Reinhardt, we have a massive attack against the U.S. at this time. ICBMs. Numerous ICBMs. Roger, understand. Over 300 missiles inbound now.
And started. The altitude. And anti-icing. March Tower, Roy 6-1 scramble. Airplanes are closed. Tango, Juliet, 0, 5, 3, 6, 1.
Private Nav, so we have an ASAP launch message at this time. Take off runway 31.
Winds 130 degrees and 5 gust down, temperature 200. Clear to launch takeoff. Roy 6-1, roger. ATC clears by 615 to maintain 5,000 feet contact, non-turret departure 35.
I've got a HARDS event.
Yeah, we've lost the underground here, too. Oh, we've lost the SAC Underground.
General, the SAC Underground just initiated a positive control launch message. It appears that they discontinued the message halfway through, or there's a detonation, or they've been destroyed. We don't know what the problem is, but I recommend a spec com check at this time.
Run spec com.
Yes, sir.
Battle staff, initiate a spec com check immediately.
SAC Airborne Command Post will exercise specific communications check. Over.
SAC Airborne Command
This is the SAC Airborne Command Post for specific communications check. SAC Command Post, this is the SAC Airborne Command Post. Over.
Nothing heard. Negative report.
Spec com check was negative. We are now in command, sir. You are the same.
Okay, we have the crews in the airplanes.
Yes, sir. The engines are started.
Launch the crews.
Yes, sir.
For alert force, klaxon, klaxon, klaxon.
Check for message transmit.
We got a good print?
Clear Oscar 11. Now, full stage fire through. It's not necessary for operation. Capsule? Yes, sir. This is Oscar 11. We just started, sir. Why? All right, sir. We'll get done right away. Topside! We gotta get out of
stations acknowledged by voice. 8th Air Force, over.
8th Air Force has numerous exceptions.
15th Air Force, over.
15th has numerous exceptions.
Sir, based on the launch reports, this is an estimate of the launch effectiveness. It looks like we've lost quite a few aircraft on the ground.
Stand by to copy the message.
Standing by.
Alpha, Tango, Golf, stand by. Message follows. Alpha, Tango, Golf, Raymond.
Sir, based on the initial launch poll and the bombers and missiles that destroyed, these are the targets that we now have uncovered and no longer have weapons against them.
Okay, have you started a replanning action?
No, we haven't, not yet, sir.
You'll get with the plans, guys.
Yes, sir, I'll do it immediately.
Thank you.
General, what we have here is a nuclear detonations as of this point in time. As you can see, most of the patterns are along the coast at this point. We do have several key installations that we do not have status on, and we do not have communications with those bases.
Start the reconnaissance for the ATC airlines, please.
Yes, sir.
5, stand by. Delta, X-ray, Whiskey, X-ray, 5, stand by.
Message follows.
That's a GCS execution from the President.
X-ray, Whiskey, X-ray.
3-0. Acknowledge now.
Oscar got it.
We've received a valid execution message. Let's proceed to the missile launch checklist.
I agree, my message valid also.
Step 1, launch keys inserted.
Roger.
Let's enable the missiles. Program
Roger.
select switch, enable. Football, LFO, unlock code inserted.
Stand by. Unlock codes inserted.
Enable switch, enable.
It's enabled.
Coordinate, enable command.
Yes, this is Oscar. We're doing all call enable. Thank you.
Key turn on my mark.
Standing by.
5, 4, 3.
Oh my God, we've had a nuclear detonation.
We're
What do you want me to do? Watch out.
"4 minutes into the attack, the strategic forces of the United States have suffered a crippling blow. Of the 1,000 Minuteman missiles, only 46 remain operational. Of the 330 B-52 bombers, all but 22 have been destroyed on the ground. Of the 41 ballistic missile submarines, 17 have been destroyed in port, and an unknown number are presumed lost at sea. The attack has been restricted to strategic military targets. 8 million Americans are dead. The United States is given an ultimatum. Any attempt at retaliation will result in the certain annihilation of America's urban population. 9 minutes later, the President orders all surviving U.S. forces to cease fire.
This attack has not happened. In a moment, we'll examine ways a first strike can be prevented.
Although the likelihood of a surprise Soviet attack on the United States is very remote, the growing possibility of such an attack being successful undermines our policy of deterrence and brings closer the risk of nuclear war. Our bomber and missile forces were designed and built in the 1950s and 60s to be secure against the threat from the relatively small and inaccurate Soviet missile force that existed at that time. Today, the United States is confronted by a Soviet missile force that is massive and highly accurate. It is now conceded that an attack on our Minuteman missiles would result in the destruction of 90% of that force. The consequences of this development are grave and far-reaching.
We always did expect to be in this position if we didn't modernize our forces. We didn't expect to be this soon, and we expected to have modernized our forces faster than we did.
Some 15 years ago, the United States decided to exercise a policy of self-restraint in our strategic force programs, hoping that we would induce reciprocal self-restraint on the part of the Soviet Union. And from that, strategic arms limitations would be reached. The idea then was that the more we did in our strategic forces, the more we'd force the other side to do, whereas the less we did, then the less they would have to do. Now, in pursuing this policy of self-restraint, we forgot the second half of the proposition, and that was the minimum we must do is assure always that our forces are thoroughly survivable against any scenario of, to use Harold Brown's words, even a well-executed surprise attack.
The Soviets, in contrast to the United States, over the last 15 years have been serious about defense. They have been deadly serious about defense. At the moment, they are not only procuring more defense hardware than the United States by 90 or 100%, they are outspending the entire free world in the area of military investment. And one must assume that they have some calculation and some motive for that behavior.
The Soviet Union now has the ability to deliver a nuclear warhead within 600 feet of a Minuteman silo. It is this accuracy, combined with the destructive power of the thousands of nuclear warheads in the Soviet arsenal, that has made our land-based missiles vulnerable.
A sound deterrent must be based upon the proposition that no major component of our deterrent forces is vulnerable. Otherwise, we've lost the ability to enforce stability in a crisis or at any other time. But the ICBM force is unique because it carries with it particular properties that are essential to carrying out a reasonable strategy of limited strikes against hard targets. It's the ICBM force, and only the ICBM force, that's capable of threatening Soviet time-urgent hardened targets. The submarine force isn't accurate enough, and the bomber force isn't rapid enough. Therefore, knowing this, the vulnerability in the ICBM force seems to me to be the most destabilizing possibility that we can face in the 1980s.
To design your land-based missile forces so that they are capable of withstanding a surprise attack from 4,000 or 5,000 Soviet ICBM warheads is a very substantial undertaking, and it takes a system of the scope and the complexity of the MX to do that. We've looked at dozens of alternative ways of doing it. We know of other ways of doing it, but they are all either more complex, more expensive than MX, or they are not technically feasible. They do not really provide the reduction in vulnerability.
The MX missile is to depend for its survival on a multiple protective shelter basing system. Each missile would have 23 shelters, between which the missile would be periodically shuttled. Because of the uncertainty as to which shelter contained the missile, all 23 would have to be attacked to be sure of destroying one missile. Such an attack is considered too costly for the Soviets to undertake. While the controversy surrounding this system has mainly concerned its great cost and environmental impact, a more urgent consideration is how soon it could be available.
That system won't begin its deployment until 1986. It won't complete it until 1989. So during the 80s, we will not have the ability to withstand a surprise attack on our land-based missiles. And that is a problem, and that does increase the risk.
There is an interim solution that the U.S. has worked on for many years and has found technically feasible. And that is to take the existing Minuteman III missile, canisterize it, modify it so that it can be easily moved from one location to another, build many silos for each individual Minuteman III missile. This would require much greater resources on the Soviets' part to destroy the land-based missiles, and would certainly give a great deal of survivability to the land-based missile force. This could have been done by now, and could certainly be done by the mid-1980s with the Minuteman III missile, because the missile already exists and doesn't have to be developed from scratch.
There's fundamentally nothing wrong with expanding the Minuteman deployment, building several thousand more shelters in the Minuteman fields, and having a deceptive basing system with a Minuteman system. But it is an illusion to think that that would happen any quicker or any cheaper or be in any way superior to the MX program.
The latest estimates show that the MX system would cost $50 billion. Why is that?
Only about a fifth of that will be the missile. The rest is the deployment scheme, the shelters, the transporters, the tracks, the roads, and so on. Why all that? Well, on the one hand, you want to have the missile hidden, concealed, so that the Russians do not know where it is, so they cannot target it, attack it with their missile warheads. On the other hand, because the government still thinks that there will be a SALT treaty in the future, and for the purposes of SALT, they want to have the missile to be seen and verifiable. That's why you have these complex shelters with sliding roofs that can be opened and closed and so on. You're trying to square a circle. You're trying to have a missile which is invisible, so that it will be safe, and visible, so that it can be counted for arms control. You try to do the two, and it costs you $50 billion.
If we look at any one system in isolation, including the MX, we can design ways of destroying that system. The way that we protect our deterrent is by having multiple systems, all of which have certain advantages as well as certain disadvantages, and the composite of those systems provides us with adequate deterrence. We are going to need the MX. One has questions about the particular mode of deployment, but it is far more important for the United States to redress the strategic arms balance than to indulge in a 5 or 10 year debate about the ideal mode of deployment.
America evolved a so-called triad of strategic forces after the Second World War: bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and nuclear submarines which could launch missiles while safely submerged. It has been suggested that we abandon our vulnerable land-based missiles and rely on submarines and bombers only. This might be possible if it were not for inherent limitations and potential problems facing these forces.
The bomber force, in my view, is at least as vulnerable to a first strike as is the ICBM force. It's highly concentrated, the alert rates are very low, and Soviet advances in technological capability have put that force into jeopardy in the time frame every bit as much as the ICBM force.
In the event of a surprise attack, it will take many minutes for the alert crews to reach their airplanes, start engines, take off, and fly far enough away to escape destruction. Most of our bombers and tankers are based in coastal areas in short range of submarine-launched missiles. It is doubtful that many aircraft would escape in the 5 to 8 minutes it would take the missiles to reach these bases. The 70% not on alert would certainly be lost. An interim solution to give our aircraft more time to get off the ground would be to move them farther inland, to the center of the continent. It would take submarine-launched missiles 5 to 10 minutes longer to reach these interior bases, giving the bombers more time to escape.
It's certainly true that the Soviets could launch an attack that either now or in the relatively near future would eliminate the great bulk of the ICBM force. It could also eliminate the non-alert bombers. I think it's very doubtful that they could eliminate both the bulk of the bombers and the bulk of the ICBM force because of problems of making that attack simultaneous. And in any event, they couldn't eliminate the submarine force. So that we're talking about not the vulnerability of the whole deterrent. We are in effect talking about the vulnerability of an important part of the deterrent.
The synchronization of such an attack is a technical difficulty that a military planner would have to deal with. And indeed it's difficult, but it's not impossible. The different kinds of missiles fly at different speeds. They fly at different altitudes. The techniques by which we try to detect these things are themselves based on vulnerable points of large radars at various places. A disarming attack is technically possible, although probably not perfectly achievable. But perfection isn't required.
If the United States sustained a surprise attack that resulted in the loss of most of its ICBMs, bombers, and submarines in port, the 25 or more nuclear missile submarines on patrol would certainly remain a powerful force, but a force of restricted usefulness. The depths they rely on for protection also make communication with them extremely difficult. Because their missiles are relatively inaccurate, They can be used only for attacking unprotected military targets and cities. It is a force of last resort that could become vulnerable.
As the Soviet Union improves their technology in submarine detection, we may be facing a problem with submarine vulnerability towards the end of the century. So we need to anticipate that, and the way to anticipate it and to prepare for it is to fix the problem in our land-based missiles by then.
It would be a new type of folly to rely exclusively on our submarines and upon submarine-borne missiles. In the first place, the submarine force is basically usable only for city busting, and the United States, along with the Soviet Union, should be eager to avoid the destruction of urban areas. The capacity of our submarine forces to do pinpoint targeting is quite limited, to say the least, and that is the reason that we must retain the ICBMs in the force structure. But more significantly, if one becomes dependent upon any single arm, such as submarines, the Soviets can devote a much higher percentage of their budget to solving their problems of anti-submarine warfare.
The new cruise missile is being offered as a crutch to help us through our period of ICBM vulnerability. The cruise missile is essentially a small pilotless aircraft which can be armed with a nuclear warhead. It is a technology that holds great promise for America's strategic forces. B-52 bombers will be equipped to carry 20 cruise missiles, which could be launched far from the borders of the Soviet Union. It is believed that such a saturation attack by 2,000 to 3,000 missiles would overwhelm the Soviet air defenses. Flying at 600 miles per hour, 200 feet above the ground, the 1,800-mile range missile would be extremely difficult to detect or shoot down. The cruise missile matches the features of the terrain below it with a digital map that it carries in its onboard computer to find its way to target with unerring accuracy.
The cruise missiles may augment the bomber force. Indeed, they will, assuming that the bomber force carrying the cruise missiles is survivable, both on the ground prior to launch and en route to target. Those cruise missiles are not exceptionally long-range cruise missiles, so the carriers for them are going to have to come very close to and probably even penetrate, to some extent, Soviet air defenses. They're an improvement. They're hardly an answer to the bomber force difficulties. They're no answer at all to the ICBM force difficulties.
Present plans are to use 150 of these B-52s as cruise missile carriers. The remaining 180 B-52s will be expected to fly to their targets. How much longer we can rely on this aircraft, even in the cruise missile role, is a matter of concern.
There's a pretty high level of interest in the Air Force in a new manned bomber, but I'd want to distinguish between a airplane that would be capable of penetrating modern active air defenses and an airplane whose only function would be to deliver cruise missiles from the exterior of the air defense system. Those are two quite different functions. Now, the B-52 is, as it's being outfitted now as a cruise missile carrier, will be quite capable of performing that latter function, a cruise missile launcher, well into the 90s.
They say the B-52s are good till 1995. Then you go to them and say, look, these aircraft were designed in the 1940s, were built in the 50s. The last one came off the production line in 62, the end of 1961. How are these bombers going to be functioning 25 years after the event? You're trying to operate highly complex aircraft 25 years old. No airline would try to maintain service. And here they are trying to penetrate a formidable Soviet air defenses with between 3,000 and 4,000 fighter aircraft, 12,000 air-to-ground missiles, operate thousands of radars. They're trying to do it with these very old aircraft, on the grounds that their technical studies show it can still be done. This is not how a serious military power proceeds.
When the B-52 bomber was ordered in the early 50s, the Air Force thought it would be replaced in a decade or so by a follow-on, more modern aircraft. The B-1 was to be such a replacement. It is the most capable bomber in the world. The B-1 uses extremely advanced engines and a variable sweep wing to carry twice the payload greater distances at much higher speed than the B-52. In 1977, with the cost per airplane approaching $100 million, plans to build 241 B-1s were canceled. The new cruise missile technology seemed to offer a cheap alternative, but the cruise missile must be carried by an airplane which can safely get off the ground and fly close enough to release its cruise missiles. The B-1 was designed to do this. Its quick response, short takeoff, rapid acceleration, and hardness against nuclear blast effects makes it many times more likely to survive a surprise attack than the B-52. Flying at treetop altitudes, 600 miles per hour, the B-1 is very difficult to detect with radar or shoot down. As a cruise missile carrier or penetrator, the B-1 remains the soonest and best hope the U.S. has for an advanced manned weapon delivery system in the 80s. The Soviet Union already has 200 similar bombers, the backfire, against which we have little defense.
We dismantled the last of our air defenses in 1975 on the argument that since we had had an ABM treaty and we were defenseless against missiles, what difference did it make if we were also defenseless against bombers? We have a token air defense, what they call enough for control of the sovereignty of the air. We're still using 6 squadrons of F-106 interceptors, which are late 50s technology, most of them manned by the reserve. I should also add that there's a very formidable Soviet bomber force, and they're going to have a free ride. They can roam the country, either after a missile exchange or instead of a missile exchange, and attack or threaten to attack more or less at will. If we deployed some modern interceptors, some F-14s or 15s, both of them are very good, under the control of AWACS aircraft, the new airborne warning and control system, we could have a very significant air defense.
The radar net, while it's old, is fairly good at higher altitudes. At lower altitudes, there are gaps. But it does present an avenue where a manned bomber, high speed, in small numbers, could penetrate without warning. And it gives him another alternative. We're talking, of course, about the backfire bomber, but it applies equally as well to the Bear and Bison aircraft, or more seriously to the aircraft he's developing at this time. He's working hard. He's got a B-1. He's got plans. He's thinking in terms of the aircraft that would follow these particular current operational models. So it also poses a very real threat.
The Soviets, in all probability, have the capacity to knock out our Minuteman system. Nobody knows for sure, including the Soviets, because no one has ever practiced an attack of this sort. There have been all sorts of tests, but there has never been any operational experience, and we hope that it remains that way. The Soviet leaders should bear in mind, of course, that while they may have the capacity to attack and destroy our Minuteman system, if we ride out the attack, that they can never even be sure of that. And they should never be given assurance that the United States would simply ride out an attack.
The reason it's important that they not have in their mind that they might succeed in such an attack has to do with what their ambitions are. What is it that they really would like to achieve? They would like to separate the United States from its European allies. They would like to neutralize and circle communist China. They would like to expand their influence and get to a position of control over the Persian Gulf. If they control the Persian Gulf, then they can dictate where the energy supplies of the Persian Gulf go. They can then, that will support their policy of dividing European NATO from the United States, of encircling China by neutralizing Japan and Southeast Asia. And it will also have a bearing on what happens in the African continent. so that their entire policy and our entire policy may depend upon what happens in the Middle East.
The rest of the world has recognized that since 1945, the balance of power has been maintained by the United States. None of our allies, the former great powers like Britain, Germany, are in a position to do that. Only the United States has the power to serve as a counterweight to the Soviet Union. And as our military capacity has flagged, and more importantly, as we have been perceived to be vacillating on foreign policy issues, our allies and the third world nations have begun to make adjustments in their position. They have begun to consider accommodations with the Soviet Union, and as a consequence, our position worldwide can deteriorate rapidly, even in the absence of an attack on the United States directly.
People look at the United States and say, to what extent are they concerned about displeasing the United States? They look at the Soviet Union and ask themselves, to what extent can they afford to provoke the Soviet Union? Then they're faced with a decision. Every day something comes up. Do we boycott the Olympics or we don't boycott the Olympics? On the invasion of Afghanistan. Do we speak for or against the Soviet Union at the United Nations debate? Do we give trade concessions to the Americans or the Russians? And when they make these decisions, they look at the power of each, and on the basis of their perception of the strength of each side, their feeling of it, on that basis they decide.
The outer world recognizes that the Soviet political system has been a failure. The only asset that the Soviet Union has is military power. They recognize that. In the absence of the employment of the threat of that military power, the free world will win in the long run.
People have seen us going downhill, downhill, downhill. First of all, we have to at least give them the feeling that we can recover. Second, we have to put substance into this by going back to a serious effort in terms of raising our military strength. We're now spending 5% and a bit of our GNP. We're competing against the Soviet Union that is spending much more than that. In absolute terms, in real terms, we have to go back competing again. That means more money. I think it means conscription, young people in the service, so we get value for our money, and it will mean, of course, a variety of weapon programs. The third thing we have to do is that in the interim period, when we move from weakness to strength, we have to be very careful, because the temptation upon the Soviet Union to intervene, to prevent us from recovering, to prevent us from reestablishing a deterrence and a balance of power, the temptation will be very great. I don't see the Russians as Nazis. The Russians are not Nazis. They don't relish war and so on. But if we do recover and start moving back towards recovery, there will be a great temptation for them to try and stop us.
When the U.S. forces become vulnerable, the Soviets will know that as well as the U.S. will know it. And the Soviets may read that as an inclination on the part of the U.S. to strike first, rather than to wait for the Soviets to attack and leave nothing surviving in the U.S. strategic forces. This contributes to strategic nuclear instability, to a greater incentive on the part of all sides to try to attack first. And the last thing you want in this world is any incentive for a country to attack with nuclear forces presumptuously, preemptively, quickly.
The question we must ask ourselves individually and very personally is whether or not we will allow the United States of America, representative of each and every light bearer of every nation, to be crucified. We are there with Pilate, with Herod. The conspirators are making their decisions, formulating their plans to ensnare the Christed nation. We must decide individually whether we will allow the crucifixion of the Christ 2,000 years later. This placing of the burden upon the individual is the only way that the nation as a whole can make a conscientious decision and a right decision. Reagan's programs are on their way. He reinstituted the B-1 bomber while cutting back the budget, or supposedly doing so. He has given a much greater budget for defense. Peace through strength is the only way to defend Christhood. America must survive through the resurrection, through higher consciousness. The foundation of the pyramid is the fourth ray. It is the certain defense which begins with the spiritual defense but does not omit the physical. We appear to be on the horns of a dilemma. We cannot engage in a freeze that is tantamount to surrender. But military strength is not the equivalent of peace and freedom. The steady increase in the size of our nuclear arsenal, as freeze proponents like to point out, has not made us any safer. The debate by both sides of the issue is couched in terms of absolutes. This intellectual polarization may be an outgrowth of a well-established American foreign policy, the Truman Doctrine of 1947 to 1950. This policy was based on the premise that the massive Soviet armed forces would be held in check by America's nuclear monopoly. This policy of containment was based on the idea that the sheer force of our overwhelming nuclear superiority would be enough to check any act of aggression on the part of the Kremlin. As a result, the United States neglected its conventional forces. Over the years, United States policy went through a number of revisions as the Soviets also became a nuclear power. But even today, we are relying on our nuclear forces to restrain conventional Soviet might. The Soviets have followed a different policy. In addition to their massive nuclear arsenal, which immobilizes our own nuclear arsenal, it is apparent that the Soviets have paid attention to conventional armaments. As a result, they have been taking, controlling, or threatening nation after nation since World War II. It is obvious that we're going to need greater conventional strength to resist the march of communism. But we are also going to need a greater sense of our mission and our national identity. What then of the Reagan administration arms buildup? General Lewis Walt of the United States Marine Corps, retired, with whom we spoke this evening, believes that the Reagan administration's military policy is correct. He told us that if we forsake the option of attack and pledge ourselves exclusively to defense, we place ourselves in a vulnerable position which may invite attack and foreclose any option for victory. General Walt told us that he believes that we should invoke the Monroe Doctrine and clean out Central America. By this he means to go in and take the communist outposts in Cuba, Nicaragua, and simply roll back communism in Central America through an offensive. He feels that the Soviets respect strength. In his words, they're reasonable people and will negotiate nuclear arms reductions if we are strong enough. General George Keegan, former Chief of the Air Force Intelligence, with whom we also spoke this evening, feels that the administration is embarked essentially on the right course. He is less inclined to believe that we can successfully negotiate with the Soviets. In his view, peace will never truly come until one government committed to the enslavement of the entire Earth's population ceases to exist. General Keegan feels as General Walt does, as Keegan said to me a number of years ago regarding South America. He thought in terms of Chile that we should go in and clean out every last communist. But neither of these men have anything really new to add to the debate. Personally, I am not in favor of policies that will ignite a nuclear war. While we see the folly of laying down our arms in the face of an aggressive enemy, it is equally rash to believe that our strength lies in arms alone. There are many flaws in the Reagan defense build-up program. Most notable is the MX missile basing plan, which even the somewhat hawkish Senate Armed Services Committee recognizes to be fatally flawed. The MX basing plan is still based on the SALT II agreement, even though the treaty was never ratified, and the President stands against it in principle. The Heritage Foundation, General Daniel Graham, former head of the DIA, and others advocate using our superior technology to build effective defenses in space against a nuclear strike from the Soviets. These defenses could be used if a small nation or terrorist group fired a single or a small volley of nuclear weapons at us. When all is said and done, we need to reassess our entire military strategy. In fact, we need to ask ourselves if we do have a strategy at all, other than spending money or avoiding war. Any strategy begins with a goal or a policy. In its ultimate sense, it is a statement of our national identity and national purpose. America, where are you going? From that point, we can define our relationships with other nations and order our priorities. One of the most serious errors of the last 6 decades has been our consistent policy of aid and trade with the Soviets. Because they have violated all the laws of civilization, the Soviet Empire is doomed to collapse. The question is, when? And will America and her allies be smart enough to ride out this period and stand fast until the ultimate debacle? In the past, the West, particularly the United States, has bailed out the Soviet Union when they were just about to collapse, to starve to death, or to go under. We've done it time and again. This time we should change our course and cease to bail out the Soviet Union from any level. Whether it's through the new pipeline, through money, through paying the interest on their debts, sending them wheat when their crops fail, or giving them the latest technology to reduce the edge between us. We must therefore adopt a systematic policy of economic sanctions against the Soviet Union. In some ways, this is easier said than done. Other nations can sell products to the Soviets, which we refuse to sell. Argentina sold the Soviets great quantities of wheat when we embargoed grain shipments. But we are still the leader of the free world. Now, during the crisis over the Falkland Islands, President Leopoldo Galtieri of Argentina is awaiting word of the American position before he acts. What will our position be? We don't quite know. But this we do know. A great portion of Argentina's $32 billion foreign debt is owed to United States banks. This will have a bearing on our policy one way or another. We have too many entangling economic alliances, banker to nation, to have a clear, straightforward foreign policy. We have too many entangling economic alliances with the Nephilim bankers and the monopoly capitalists. And we have this government promising the New York banks to underwrite their loans to foreign nations. This could bankrupt us and work against the internal economy of the nation as surely as our current inflation and recession. So in view of this, we must do two things: enact complete economic sanctions against the Soviets, decide what parts of the Soviet economy we want to starve: technology, grain, raw materials, etc. Then we use our economic, diplomatic, military, and communications assets to persuade other nations not to sell the Soviets those items. We are in a game of power politics, economic politics, and we have to play it with our allies as well as our enemies. There are very few nations, including our closest friends, who will stand with us 100% against world communism. And when we stand, and we had a president who did, and when he stood against the Nephilim and the bankers and the internationalists, he was assassinated. His name was Abraham Lincoln. Any individual in the United States, any son of God who has ever stood against the combined forces of world Antichrist has been crucified. Today we are asked to stand together, millions strong, as Christed ones, who understand the meaning of the coming of the Lord our righteousness into our very temples. Surely the Christ, multiplied many millions of times over, can defeat the Nephilim adversary, especially when we realize that their evil is not real and their appearance has no power. Some argue our economy depends on trade with communist nations, at least key sectors of it, like the farmers. We can adjust our economy to trade without the Soviet bloc. If we reestablish a free market economy, the pinch will not be too severe. But if it requires us to pull in our belts, the economic loss will not be as great as either war or surrender. Finally, we need to learn to communicate, not propagandize, for that entails calculated distortions or omissions of the truth. We need to set the record straight about the relative values of a government based on the principles of freedom and a system based on tyranny. The peoples of the world will know the difference. The passing through the initiation of the crucifixion, in the sense of willingly being fastened to the cross of eternal life, has never been entered into without personal sacrifice. If you are going to bargain for eternal life, And for world salvation, the price is personal sacrifice. There is no way that America can win in this battle of the forces of light over the forces of evil without personal sacrifice. We seem to be in an age when our people have less ability to sacrifice than they ever did before. Yet I believe that if the full truth were known and the illumination given, we would find our nation full and brimming with fine people of all ages who would gladly make the sacrifice in order for the victory to appear and the continuity of the community. Each small sacrifice you make contributes to the mainstream of life in the whole world. Because you have sacrificed, we exist as a community, not fragmented. One thing we have all discovered out of the process of sacrifice is that when we say, Father, if thou be willing, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. We have discovered that in that moment, ministering angels come unto us. We are sustained, supported, and there is given to us all that we require and more to live again, to serve again, to deliver life's ultimatum. We have a mandate for peace that can be won without any bloodshed. Surely this is the greatest message in the nuclear age. Surely this understanding. Argentina should be the ally of the United States and Great Britain. Yet it trades with the Soviet Union while its military regime is strongly anti-communist. We find many unprincipled forces in South America, and we find them in the nations of Europe. We find continuously the seed of the wicked sown among the good wheat. In every era of history, as Solzhenitsyn has pointed out, the forces of tyranny can always find their betrayers within the nation. Those who are endowed with the living flame of truth and with the presence of the Lord, our righteousness in their midst, always overcome those forces even when they are outnumbered. The overcoming is always there when the individual